It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from dark, hidden sources which made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying toward the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok Allen set up new currents in my mind and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives made it unsafe to be seen talking to him. Yet, the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth. And old Zadok Allen must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and caution, and in my youthful egotism I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the fireman would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then, I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness, and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for, shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of Gilman House, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf and being free to question Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister," behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked along to Water Street and turned southwards amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins. At length I saw a grass-grown opening toward the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of an earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long and secret colloquy. So I guided my companion down the lane and picked out spots to sit in among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's Venus garrulousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers, and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. Toward the end of the second hour, I felt my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forwards and listen alertly. My back was toward the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it. and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent towards me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. Him that found out more than what was good for him in the South Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business. Even the new ones, and the best of our mensfolk killed to privateering in the War of 1812 or were lost in the Ellezy brig in the Ranger Snow. Both of them Gilman ventures. Obed Marsh, he had 3 ships afloat. Brigantine Columbia, Brig Hetty, and Bark Summitry Queen. He was the only one as kept on with the East Indian and Pacific trade, though Esdras Martin's barkentine Malay Pride made a venture as late as 28. Never was nobody like Captain Obed, old Limis Satan. I can mind him telling about foreign parts, and calling all the folks stupid for going to Christian meetings and bearing their burdens meek and lowly. Says they ought to get better gods like some of the folks in the Indians. Gods that would bring them good fishing in return for their sacrifices, and would really answer folks' prayers. Matt Elliott, his first mate, talked a lot too, only he was against folks doing any heathen things. Told about an island east of Otaheite, where there was a lot of old stone ruins, older than anybody knew anything about, kinda like them on Ponape in the Carolinas, but with carvings of faces that looked like the big statues on Easter Island. There was a little volcanic island near there too, where there was other ruins with different carvings, ruins all worn away like they'd been under the sea and with pictures of awful monsters all over them. Well, Sir Matt, he says the natives around there had all the fish they could catch, and sported bracelets and armlets and head rings made out of some queer kind of gold, and covered with pictures of monsters just like the ones carved over the ruins of the little island. Sort of fish-like frogs or frog-like fishes that was drawed in all kinds of positions like they was human beings. Nobody could get out of them where they got all the stuff, and all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish in plenty even, when the very next islands had lean pickings. Matt, he got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices, besides, that lots of the handsome young folk would drop out of sight for good from year to year, and that there wasn't many old folks around, and he thinks some of the folks looked damn queer, even for Kanakies. It took Obed to get the truth out of them heathen. I don't know how he done it, but he begun by trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked him where they come from and if he could get more, and finally wormed the whole story out of the old chief. Wallachia, they called him. Nobody but Obed ever believed the old yeller devil, but the captain could read folks like they was books. Nobody ever believes me now when I tell them. I don't suppose you will, young feller. Though, come to look at you have kinda got them sharp reading eyes like Obed had. The old man's whisper grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere pretentiousness of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but a drunk fantasy. Well, sir, Obed, you learnt that there's things on this earth as most folks never heard about, and wouldn't believe if they ever did hear. It seems these Kanakies was sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to some kind of old god things that lived under the sea, and getting all kinds of favor in return. They met the things on the little islet with the queer ruins, and it seems them awful pictures of fish frog monsters was supposed to be pictures of these things. Maybe they was the kind of critters that got all the mermaid stories and such started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems there was some of the things alive in the stone buildings when the island come up so sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakies caught wind they was down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being scared, and pieced up a bargain before long. Them things liked human sacrifices. Had 'em ages before, but lost track of the upper world after a time. What they'd done to the victims, it ain't for me to say, and I guess Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was alright with the heathens, because they'd be having a hard time and was desperate about everything. They give a starting number of young folks to the sea things twice a year, May Eve and Halloween, regulars could be, Also gives some of the carved knickknacks they made. What the things agreed to give them in return was plenty of fish. They'd drive them in from all over the sea, and a few gold-like things now and then. Well, as I say, the natives met the things on the little volcanic islet, going there in canoes with the sacrifices, etc., and bringing back any of the gold-like jewels as was coming to them. At first, the things never did go out on the main island, but after a time they come to want to. Seems they hankered after mixing with the folks, and having joint ceremonies on the big days, May Eve and Halloween. You see, they was able to live both in and out of water, what they call amphibians, I guess. The Kanakys told them as how folks from the other islands might want to wipe them out if they got wind of their being there. But they says they don't care much, because they could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. That is, any as didn't have certain signs, such as was used once by the old ones, whoever they was. But not wanting to bother, they lay low when anybody visited the island. When it come to mating with them toad-like fishes, the Kanakys kinda balked. But finally, they learned something as put a new face on the matter. Seems that human folks has got kinda a relation to such water beasts, that everything alive come out of the water once, and only needs a little change to go back again. Them things told the Kanakys that if they mixed bloods, there'd be children as would look human at first, but later turn more and more like the things, until finally, they'd take to the water and join the main lot of things down there. And this is the important part, young feller. Them as turned into fish things and went into the water wouldn't never die. Them things never died, except they was killed violent. Well, sir, it seems by the time Obed knowed them islanders, they was all full of fish blood from them deep water things. When they got old and begun to show it, they was kept hidden till they felt like taking to the water and quitting the place. Some was more touched than others, and some never did change quite enough to make it to the water. But mostly they turned out just the way them things said. Them as was born more like the things changed early, but them who was nearly human sometimes stayed on the island till they was past 70, though they'd usually go down under for trial trips before that. Folks as had took to the water generally come back a good deal to visit, so as a man would often be talking to his own 5 times great-grandfather who'd left the dry land couple of 100 years afore or so. Everybody got out of the idea of dying, except in canoe wars with the other islanders, or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or some snake bite or plague or sharp galloping ailments or something before they could take to the water, but simply look forward to a kind of change that wasn't a bit horrible after a while. They thought that what they'd got was well worth all they had to give up, and I guess Obed kinda come to think the same himself when he chewed over old Wallachei's story a bit. Wallachea, though, was one of the few as hadn't got none of the fish blood, being of a royal line and all that, intermarried with royal lines on other islands. Wallachea, he showed Obed a lot of rites and incantations as had to do with the sea things, and let him see some of the old folks in the villages as changed a lot from human shape. Somehow or other, though, he never would let him see one of the regular things right out of the water. In the end, he gave him a funny kind of thingamajig made out of lead or something that he said would bring up the fish things from any place in the water where they might be a nest of them. The idea was to drop it down with the right kind of prayers and such. Wallachea allowed as the things was scattered all over the world, so anybody that looked about could find a nest and bring them up if they was wanted. Matt, he didn't like the business at all, and wanted Obed should keep away from the island. But the captain was sharp for gain, and found he could get them gold-like things so cheap it would pay him to make a specialty of them. Things went on that way for years, and Obed got enough of that gold-like stuff to make him start the refinery in Waite's old run-down fallen mill. He didn't dare sell the pieces like they was, for folks would be all the time asking questions. All the same, his crews would get a piece and dispose of it now and then, even though those swore to keep quiet, and he let his womenfolk wear some of the pieces as was more human-like than most. Well, come about 38 when I was 7 years old, Obed, he found the island people all wiped out between voyages. Seems the other islanders caught wind of what was going on and had took matters into their own hands. Suppose they must have had, after all, them old magic signs, as the sea thing says they was the only things they was ever afraid of. No telling what any of them Kanakys will chance to get a hold of when the sea bottom throws up some island with ruins older than the deluge. Pious cusses these was. They didn't leave nothing standing on either the main island or the little volcanic island, except what parts of the ruins was too big to knock down. In some places, they was little stones strewed about, like charms, with something on 'em like what you call a swastika nowadays. Probably them was the old one signs. Folks all wiped out, no trace of no gold-like things, and none of the nearby Kanakys would breathe a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit that they'd ever been people on that island. That naturally hit Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole of Innsmouth too, because in seafaring days what profited the master of a ship generally profited a crew proportionate. Most of the folk around the town took the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned. But they was in bad shape because the fishing was petering out and the mills wasn't doing none too well. Then's the time Obed he begun a cursing at the folks for being dull sheep and praying to a Christian heaven as didn't help them none. He told 'em he knowed of folks as prayed to gods that give something you really needed, and says if a good bunch of men would stand by him, he could maybe get a hold of certain powers as would bring plenty of fish and quite a bit of gold. Of course, them as served on the Cemetery Queen and see the island knowed what he meant, and it wasn't none too anxious to get close to the sea things like they heard tell on. But them as didn't know what it was all about kinda got swayed by what Obed had to say, and begun to ask him what he could do to set him on the way to the faith as would bring him results. Here the old man faltered, fumbled, and lapsed into a moody and apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder and then turning back to stare fascinatedly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he didn't answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within it a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any real substantial foundation, but nonetheless the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in references to strange jewels clearly akin to the Malayan tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from some strange island, and possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself rather than this antique troper. I handed Zadok the bottle and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much liquor, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket, then beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself. I bent close to catch any articulate words he might mutter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he was really forming words, and I could grasp a fair proportion of them. Poor Matt, he was always against it. Tried to line up the folks on his side and had long talks with the preachers. No use, they run the Congregational parsons out of town, and the Methodist feller quit. Never did see resolved Babcock, the Baptist parson, again. Wrath of Jehovah. I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard and seen what I seen. Dagon and Ashtoreth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf and the idols of Canaan and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations. He stopped again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness and snapped out some more obscure phrases. Don't believe me, huh? Then just tell me, young feller, why Captain Obed and 20-odd other folks used to row out to Devil Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear 'em all over town when the wind was right. Tell me that, huh? And tell me why Obed was always dropping heavy things down into the deep water to the other side of the reef where the bottom shoots down like a cliff, lower than you can sound. Tell me what he done with that funny-shaped lead thingamajig as Wallachia give him. And what did they howl on May Eve and again next Halloween? And why the new church parsons, fellers as used to be sailors, wear them queer robes and cover themselves in them gold-like things. The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back, for he began to cackle evilly. Beginning to see, hey? Maybe you'd like to have been me in them days, when I see things at night out to sea from the cupola atop my house. Oh, I can tell ya, little pitchers have big ears, and I wasn't missing nothing of what was gossiped of Captain Obed and folks out to the reef. How about that night I took my pa's ship's glass up to the cupola, and seed the reef a-bristling thick with shapes that dove off quick soon as the moon riz. Obed and the folks was in some dory, but them shapes dove off the far side into the deep water and never came back up. How'd you like to be a little shaver alone in a cupola watching shapes as wasn't human shapes? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with a nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. Suppose one night you seed something heavy heaved off of Obed's dory beyond the reef, and then learned next day a young feller was missing from home, huh? Did anybody ever see hide or hair of Hiram Gilman again, did they? And Nick Pierce and the Wellyweight, and Adoniram Southwick, and Henry Garrison, huh? Shapes talking sign language with their hands, them as had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed began to get his feet again. Folks see his 3 daughters a-wearing gold things as nobody ever seen before, and smoke started coming out of the refinery chimney. Other folks are prospering too. Fish begun to swarm into the harbor fit to kill, and heaven knows what size cargoes we begun to ship out to Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then that Obed got the old branch railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and come up in sloops. But they was all lost. Nobody ever did see him again. And just then our folks organized the Esoteric Order of Dagon and bought Masonic Hall off in Cavalry Commandery for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason again, and selling, but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember, I ain't say Obed was set on having things just like they was on Kanaki Isle. I don't think he aimed at first to do no mixing or raise no youngsters to take the water and turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things and was willing to pay heavy, and I guess the others was satisfied for a while. Come in 46, the town done some looking and thinking for itself. Too many folks missing, too much wild preaching at meeting of a Sunday, too much talk about that reef. I guess I'd done a bit by telling Selectman Mowry what I had seen from the cupola. There was a party one night as followed Obed's crowd out to the reef, and I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day, Obed and 32 others was in a goal, with everybody a-wondering just what was afoot and just what charge against him could be got to hold. God, if anybody could look ahead, a couple of weeks later when nothing had been thrown into the sea for that long. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I let him keep silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high water the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again I strained to catch his whispers. That awful night I seed him. I was up in the cupola. Hordes of 'em, swarms of 'em, all over the reef and swimming up the harbor into the manway. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night? They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open it. Then he climbed out the kitchen window with his musket to find Selectman Mowry and see what he could do. Mounds of the dead and dying, shots and screams, shouting in an old square and town square in New Church Green, goal throat open, proclamation, treason. Called it the plague when folks come in and found half our people missing. Nobody left but them as would join in with Obed and them things or else keep quiet. Nobody heard of my pa no more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything's cleaned up in the morning, but they was traces. Obed, he kinda takes charge and says things is gonna be changed. Others'll worship with us at meeting time, and certain houses is gotta entertain guests. They wanted to mix like they done with the Kanakys, and he for one didn't feel so bound to stop 'em. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He says they brung us fish and treasure and should have what they hankered after. Nothing was to be different on the outside. Only we was to keep shy as strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We all had to take the oath of Dagon, and later on there was second and third oaths that some of us took. Them as would help special. You'd get special rewards, gold and such. No use balking, for they was millions of them down there. They'd rather not start rising up and wiping out humankind, but if they was gave way and forced to, they could do a lot towards just that. We didn't have them old charms to cut 'em off like the folks in the South Sea did, and them Kanakees wouldn't never give away their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and harborage in the town when they wanted it, and they'd let well enough alone. Wouldn't bother no strangers as might bear tales outside, that is, without they got pryin'. All in the band of the faithful Order of Dagon, and the children should never die. Go back to the Mother Hydra and Father Dagon, what we all come from once. Old Zadok was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul. To what pitiful deep hallucinations had his liquor plus his hatred of the decay, alienage, and disease around him brought that fertile, imaginative brain? He began to moan now, and tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depth of his beard. God, what I seen since I was 15-year-old. The old folks what was missing, and them as kilt theirselves, them as told things in Arkham or Ipswich or such places was all called crazy, like you're calling me right now, but God, what I have seen. They'd have killed me long ago for what I know, only I took the first and second oaths of Dagon off an Obed, so was protected unless a jury of 'em proved I told things known and deliberate. But I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd have died rather than taken that. It got worse around Civil War time, when children born since 46 began to grow up. Some of 'em, that is. I was afraid. Never did no pryin' after that awful night, and never see one of 'em, close in all my life. That is, never no full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I'd had plenty of guts or sense, I'd have never come back, but settled away from here. But folks wrote me things wasn't so bad. That, I suppose, was because government draftmen was in town after 63. After the war, it was just as bad again. People began to fall off. Mills and shops shut down, shipping stopped, and the harbor choked up. Railroad give up, but they never stopped swimming in and out of the river from that cursed reef of Satan, and more attic windows got boarded up, and more noises was heard in houses as wasn't supposed to have nobody living in 'em. Folks outside have heard their stories about us. Suppose you've heard of plenty of 'em, seeing what questions you ask. Stories about things they've seen now and then, and about that queer jewelry as still comes from somewheres and ain't quite all melted up, but nothing ever gets definite. Nobody will believe nothing. They call them gold-like things pirate loot, and allow the Innsmouth folk as foreign blood or as distempered or something. Besides, them that lives here show off as many strangers as they can, and encourage the rest not to get very curious, especially around nighttime. Beasts balk at the critters, horses worse than mules, but when they got autos, that was alright. In 46, Captain Obed took a second wife that nobody in town never see. Some says he didn't want to, but was made by them as he called in. Had 3 children by her, 2 as disappeared young, but one gal as looked like anybody else was educated in Europe. Obed finally got her married off by a trick to an Arkham feller as didn't suspect nothing, but nobody outside'll have nothing to do with Innsmouth folk now. Barnabas Marsh, that runs the refinery now, is Obed's grandson by his first wife, son of Onesiphorus, his eldest son. But his mother was another of them, and wasn't ever seed outdoors. Right now Barnabas is about changed, can't shut his eyes no more, and is all out of shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take to the water soon. Maybe he's tried it already. They do sometimes go down for little spells before they go for good. Ain't been seen about in public for nigh on 10 year. Don't know how his poor wife can feel. She come from Ipswich, and they nigh lynched Barnabas when he courted her 50-odd year ago. Obed, he died in 78, and all the next generations is gone now. The first wife's children dead, and the rest, God knows. The sound of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood from maudlin tearfulness to watchful fear. He would pause now and then to renew those nervous glances over his shoulder or out toward the reef, and despite the wild absurdity in his tale, I could not help beginning to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller, and seemed to be trying to whip up his courage with louder speech. "Hey you, why don't you say something? How'd you like to be living in a town like this, with everything a-rottin' and a-dyin' and boarded up monsters crawling and bleating and barking and hopping around, black cellars and attics every which way you turn? How'd you like to hear the howlin' at night from the churches of the Order of Dagon, and know what's doing part of the howlin'? How'd you like to hear what comes from the awful reef every May Eve in Hallowmas? Hey? Think the old man is crazy, huh? Well, sir, let me tell you that ain't the worst." Zadok was really screaming now, and the mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I cared to own. "Curse ye, don't sit there staring at me with them eyes. I tell Obed Marsh he's in hell, and he's gotta stay there. In hell, I says, can't get me. I ain't done nothing nor told nobody nothing. Oh, you, young feller? Well, even if I ain't told nobody nothing yet, I'm a-going to now. You just sit still and listen to me, boy. This is what I ain't never told nobody. I says I didn't do no pryin' after that night, but I found things out just the same. You want to know what the real horror is, hey? Well, it's this. It ain't what them fish devils has done, but what they're a-going to do. They're bringing things up out of where they come from down into the town. Been doing it for years and slackening up lately. Them houses north of the river betwixt Water and Main Streets is full of 'em. Them devils and what they brung and what they get ready. I say when they get ready. Ever hear tell of a shaggoth? Hey, do you hear me? I tell ya, I know what them things be. I seen 'em one night when a hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the old man's shriek almost made me faint. His eyes looking past me towards the Mulderous Sea were positively starting from his head, while his face was a mask of fear worthy of Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and he made no motion as I turned my head to look at whatever he had glimpsed. There was nothing that I could see, only the incoming tide, with perhaps one set of ripples more local than the long-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that fear-frozen face into a chaos of twitching eyelids and mumbling gums. Presently his voice came back, albeit as a trembling whisper. "Get out of here, get out of here. They seen us, get out for your life. Don't wait for nothing, they know now, run for it, quick. Outs of this town." Another heavy wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf and changed the ancient's whispers to another inhuman and blood-curdling scream. Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder and dashed wildly inland towards the street, reeling northward around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there, and when I reached Water Street and looked along it towards the north, there was no remaining trace of Zadok Allen.